Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Surprise second episode this week, a little bit more than normal, but like I mentioned last episode, there are some things going on in the sports world that have piqued my interest to want to have a second episode here. So, I want to talk a little sports media today. And if you are unaware of what's going on in this lawsuit with Fox Sports, buckle up because it's a lot. We're going to go through a couple of the elements here and talk kind of big picture about what this really means societally. So let's start with the key figure of this lawsuit, the plaintiff of the lawsuit, which is Nushin Faraji. Nushin Faraji is a former makeup artist and hairstylist who used to be employed for Fox Sports. So she would work with the Colin Cowherd show. She worked on Undisputed, which was the Skip Bayless and Shannon Sharp show that ran for many years on that network. And Ms. Faraji has had a lot to say specifically about Skip Bayless, Joy Taylor, head of content at Fox Sports, Charlie Dixon, and Emmanuel Acho. And it's quite frankly, it's a 42-page document. It's damning. It's messy. It's a lot of things. And I kind of want to go piece by piece here. I want to start with Skip Bayless and Charlie Dixon. So, Faraji, now these are all claims that Faraji has made. Obviously, nothing has been substantiated. There have been no comments that I know of refuting or corroborating this sort of commentary from Faraji. So we're only going off what her lawsuit says. So apparently, both Bayless and Dixon were incredibly inappropriate with her, and while she was working there, they would take her out to dinner and inappropriately touch her. At one point, Skip Bayless had propositioned her for sex multiple times to the point where he offered her $1.5 million to sleep with him. And one thing that I found incredibly kind of ridiculous was she claimed that when she turned him down and she told him, "Hey, you have a wife." And he's like, "Hey, you're Muslim, aren't you? Well, don't you guys have 3 husbands?" And that's a sort of kind of insensitive comment that takes, which is already bad, misogyny and sexual harassment, and turns it into him being a racist, right? So, or at least somebody who's just culturally insensitive to another person's culture. And a lot of these guys, I think, in power, these white men in power at these networks or just in corporate America in general, just have for so long kind of gotten away with stuff, and I don't know if any of you have ever watched Mad Men, the TV show that AMC had, kind of takes place in the ad agency business in New York City in the 50s, where slapping women on the butt is normal, where flirting with them openly is normal, where making them uncomfortable with sexual innuendo incredibly normal, right? That's kind of the world that was around 70 years ago. And you would like to think that we have grown as a society where we can have more women coming into the workplace and we accept them on their merit and what they bring to the table. And a lot of people I've found in the wake of these allegations are just kind of like making jokes about Skip and Dixon as just horny guys, right? And a little bit going away from the fact that they're sexually harassing people. They're trying to put a woman who works with them in a compromising position and almost kind of guilt her into sleeping with them, and it's just kind of a very toxic kind of environment there. And when you look at somebody like Skip and you see somebody who's been in the journalism industry now really since like the 70s and 80s, well, going back to when he worked in Dallas and covered SMU and the Cowboys. And he has largely been, for a bulk of his career, a big deal, right? After his journalism career, he got into TV with ESPN, was a big deal there with First Take and Stephen A. Smith. Then was a big deal when it came to going to FS1 and was recruited for FS1 specifically. He was going to be the star of that network. And, seeing him act like this shows a person who is used to getting what he wants. And him being so angry that he's not getting what he wants because she was refusing his advances. It's the same thing for Dixon, where, these guys are working and it's like a proximity thing, so almost like a weird fulfilling of a fantasy that they might have seen in like a porn video or something. And it's these men in power who feel that they're entitled to something like that, right? They're entitled to, if they employ a beautiful woman, that they are entitled to receive sexual favors from that beautiful woman because they're a man in power. That's just how it works, right? And I think that that's a slightly underreported aspect of this. The grossness of these guys to think that they were just allowed to have that, right? That it should be expected that it's coming their way. What has gotten the most coverage, though, is the Joy Taylor aspect. And so Joy Taylor, if you don't know, was previously a radio host in Miami. She's the younger sister of former Dolphins defensive end Jason Taylor. And she eventually gets a job on Undisputed as a moderator, had also done the studio update position for Colin Cowherd on his show, and now is one of the hosts of Speak on FS1, which includes Emmanuel Acho. And Taylor has been accused of sleeping with Charlie Dixon, been accused of sleeping with Emmanuel Acho in the aim of advancing her career. And kind of it came to a head where she was sleeping with Charlie Dixon, which Nushin Faraji knew about and kind of confronted her about, like, it's kind of gross. What are you doing? And, Taylor was like, look, I'm doing this to kind of advance my career. So when it came down to needing a moderator for the Undisputed show with Bayless and Shannon Sharp, Dixon put in a word for Joy Taylor, even though Skip Bayless didn't want her there. He wanted somebody more experienced. And that's when, that's where the in happened. And I'm not here to say that doing that is wrong, right? I think that stuff like that, favors, relationships, they all get prioritized when you're climbing up the corporate ladder. I've been a part of companies that have had people who have been prioritized over other people because of the relationship they had, whether it was romantic or not, right? Now, morally suspect, sure, and somewhat comedic when you see the commentary that Joy has had over the years about, women who quote unquote sleep their way to the top. But she has kind of been character assassinated over this, right? And a lot of people have said, well, she's set women back in sports 50 years. And I think that last part, in sports, is important to kind of note, right? Women in sports have not had an easy go. Covering locker rooms, Title IX, all this stuff has been a part of the conversation. The lack of access, the lack of taking them seriously. You think about Erin Andrews, where she was kind of bursting on the scene, and you had people trying to get pictures of her naked and sell them online. You've had a lot of these women reporters who have been objectified for their bodies and not valued as contributing members to the journalism space. And which is upsetting because there's a lot of great women reporters in the sports space that are excellent. Mina Kimes is a great analyst. Miriam Fader is one of my favorite writers in sports who writes for The Ringer, and she has published a couple of books. And you have a lot of these reporters who are excellent, right? And they do great investigative journalism. They analyze the game well. So and it kind of has been a way to shed away from this just selling an attractive face on TV type of thing, right? I think like Hannah Storm, for example, has had a very great Sports Center career, and so when you have somebody like Joy Taylor who is exploiting that sort of sleep your way to the top stereotype, and it's benefited her by giving her a platform to speak her opinions, it's a little troubling. But at the same time, we are not holding men to that same standard, right? Like, if I remember I used to work with a company that was in close communication with Best Buy. Best Buy had a female CEO, Corey Barry, still a CEO of Best Buy. And she was kind of roped in kind of like a sex scandal, so to speak. And I thought, it's only a big story. It was only a big talking point because she was a relatively attractive middle-aged woman. If she was like an older guy, I don't think it would be as big of a story. Or I just feel like the standards are a little bit different. People are kind of, again, character assassinating Joy Taylor for setting women back and blah, blah, blah. But not as much character assassination has gone towards Skip Bayless and Charlie Dixon. And I think that's troubling, right? That it's almost like a lot of men have been waiting for a woman to do something like this so they could have their, you see, I was trying to tell you all along moment. And just because this is the case, now a lot of people have jumped to speculation, like, oh, wait until we hear about who Taylor Rooks is sleeping with. Wait until we figure out who Molly Karam is sleeping with, Stephen A. Smith. So let's, see the dam to break, and it's kind of led to this kind of bum rush of accusations that have yet to be founded, right? And again, we don't know how true all of this is. You got to take Nashim Faraji at face value, but you don't fully know. No one's admitted to anything, right? My big issue here is something that is going completely under the radar with the stuff that Joy Taylor said to Faraji. And it revolves around when she was sleeping with both Charlie Dixon and Emmanuel Acho allegedly be able to get her show Speak. And Faraji kind of said, aren't you worried that this might kind of blow up in your face if one finds out about the other, sort of thing? And according to Faraji, Taylor said that if something goes down, I'm not going to be one of these people who loses their job over it, so I'm just going to go ahead and say that he touched me inappropriately, if anything, if it came to it. So, sexual assault, sexual violence, rape is borders on an endemic in this country, right? It's a very real issue. It shouldn't be taken lightly. We all know that. To kind of suggest that you're going to quote-unquote pull the rape card when nothing happened, when everything was consensual, just to preserve yourself. It feels like when, in the 17th and 18th century, when, a woman would say something and they would accuse her of witchcraft and then she'd be burned at the stake. It's kind of that same sort of energy where if you're just accusing somebody of sexual assault, as it suits you, that sets a terrible precedent. Jails are filled with men who have been wrongly accused, incorrectly accused by women claiming that they had been assaulted. And there's no real repercussion for that. If a woman falsely accuses somebody, they serve 5 years in jail. The system doesn't make that woman serve 5 years in jail. It's just not how it works. So making light of that, I think, sets women back further than the whole sleeping to the top, or how you want to progress your career. That's your priority. They made those hiring decisions. That's on them, right? But to just kind of be able to say, hey, I'm going to derail something to preserve my own skin is, just kind of deplorable. And I think I'm surprised that hasn't been more of the focus. Instead, it's just kind of like a lot of these crass sex jokes of like, oh, she let anybody do this, anybody do that, blah, blah, blah. Whereas, using sexual abuse that never happened as a weapon, I think sets a really bad precedent. Because if that becomes an acceptable thing to do, one, you don't know who to believe anymore. Two, who's to say that more people wouldn't employ that strategy in the media, right? As we are adding more and more talented women journalists, and maybe you don't get a job, and then you say, well, it's because he raped me, or it's because I was assaulted, or whatever the case. And you can't really prove it one way or the other, and then you just got to take the person at their word, and then, that person who was doing the hiring or firing, they are let go as a result. So I think that that's a dangerous path here. But ultimately, what this whole lawsuit kind of indicated to me is just this toxic culture that we have when it comes to sports media and just the general orbit of sports in general. There's a machismo that comes with covering sports and with being around athletes, right? There's a lot of quote unquote type A personalities that have played games and are analyzing now, right? So it's like a very competitive space. So you end up doing whatever you can to advance. And I think we need to be a little bit careful here on the way that we kind of view this stuff. We need to look at what a Joy Taylor did or what a Skip Bayless did and say, yeah, that's deplorable. We need to course correct and, be able to have people that aren't going to do this sort of thing. And, you have these situations where people get more and more power, more and more clout, and they feel like they've reached a certain stature. And ultimately, you learn how quickly it could all fall apart. And, Skip Bayless, I think, since he left FS1, has kind of been doing his own podcast thing, still tweeting, doing whatever. I think this should blacklist him because, again, we're creating a hostile work environment. But similarly, with Joy Taylor, I think the using sexual assault as a weapon aspect is something incredibly deplorable. And it's something that, if proven correct, should be punishable, and I just think that there needs to be some sort of code of conduct here, how to present yourself, how to handle yourself in this sort of situation, and it's incredibly messy. And I think that we're going to see more of that come out potentially with these other sports networks. And in that sense, it kind of makes me happy that a lot of independent media is kind of starting to rise, where you're seeing more independent creators out there kind of covering sports, and I think that's good because a lot of these old school institutions have these old school types and, from carryover from the early days of TV and newspapers and, where this type of stuff was kind of brushed under the rug. As independent creators, you would hope that there'll be a little bit more of a stance there to get people who aren't going to be those type of bad actors. I think that's something that we should be prioritizing in the coverage that we have moving forward. And, all this kind of reminds me of a book I read recently, which is called Sidelined by Julie DeCaro, who's a sports journalist herself and was talking about the sexual harassment and innuendo and stuff that she dealt with in the locker room. And if our fellow media members are doing this, then that's the indication that we got a real culture, image, and perception problem here within sports media. And you could say part of that is just kind of an indication of culture in American society right now where it's at, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But I think ultimately we all need to be better, and one, don't inappropriately approach people for sex, and two, don't celebrate somebody who uses sex as a way to advance their career, right? Especially somebody who uses sex as a way to blackmail somebody, right? So it's a bad day for Fox Sports. It's a bad lawsuit. I assume they're probably going to try and settle this out of court and minimize the exposure here. And if everything's true, I'm sorry for Miss Faraji, right? Having to deal with that while trying to make your career as a hair and makeup artist, is traumatizing to say the least. So ultimately, we, as sports media collective, You just need to be better. All right, that's going to wrap it up for another episode of the Deep Cover Podcast. Thank you as always for tuning in. Make sure to check out the podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. Video is available for the pod on YouTube and Spotify, so make sure to check that out. Thank you again. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Until next time, Deep Cover Podcast.